The first question is, what about your culture are you the proudest of?
What I'm proudest about our culture is the fact that our tribal people have been so resilient in the face of very difficult times. Because of course the tribes in New England experienced the immigration from Europe in the 1600s, and so we experienced severe devastation between the 1600s and mid 1700s, losing 90% of our population and having 90% of our lands taken from us. But it didn't deter our tribal leaders from continuing to exercise their sovereignty and to engage with the new people that came to these shores in a diplomatic way. Because we are a tribal nation, we exist as a tribal government, and we definitely engage with other nations in that same way. So they have really provided the roadmap and the example for us in terms of how we would continue on in this day and in this time to continue to exercise that diplomacy and to continue to engage not only with the United States, but with other Native nations and other nation states throughout the world. And I think that's really important because when we think about our tribal leaders in the 1700s, they were engaging with the crowns of Europe. Because that was the diplomatic relations that they had. It wasn't with the people who eventually became the state of Connecticut, or the government that became the state of Connecticut, or the government that became the United States. Initially, we were engaging with the crowns of Europe because that's who we were dealing with. And so I think their legacy endures to this day, and that's what's so important about the work that we do now.
Yes, thank you. So what do you see as the overarching issue or overarching issues with Indigenous tribes, and in particular the Mohegan Nation?
I think the overarching issue for most tribes throughout the United States is the fact that we are rebuilding our nations, that we experience those devastating losses, but we continue to look at ways to ensure that we respect our ancestors, we respect where we came from, and that we rebuild those things that were lost. And I think the perfect example of that is the fact that we're restoring our native language. It hasn't been spoken fluently for 100 years. And the reason it wasn't spoken fluently was the elders declined to teach the next generations to speak it because those elders experienced bias. They were sometimes beaten for speaking their language, and they were denigrated for speaking their language. So they didn't teach it to the generations, and so we don't have fluency in our native tongue, as other tribes do not as well. But we're rebuilding that, and we're very fortunate because we were able to rematriate the Delia Fielding's diaries back to Connecticut from Columbia University. They safeguarded them until we approached them for the return, and they were only too happy to return them. And she was our tribal medicine woman in the late 1800s and 1900s. And she kept diaries in Mohegan and English, and she knew that she wasn't keeping them for herself. That was very prescient on her part, that she would be keeping those diaries for next generations. And most recently, Dartmouth College sent home all of Samson Occam's documents and all of his writings. So those are his writings are the earliest examples of the Mohegan language in writing. He was educated in Latin, Greek, English, and other Algonquian languages. He was a very learned man and helped establish Dartmouth College. He traveled to Europe and helped to fundraise for what he thought was going to be an Indian college. By the time he came home, the charter had changed, and it moved from Lebanon, Connecticut to New Hampshire, where it eventually was founded. And the charter changed for it no longer to be an Indian college. So he was a little disillusioned by that. But he is somebody who is very important to our culture, to the Dartmouth culture, and then also to the Brotherton tribe, because he ended up migrating to Wisconsin and forming the Brotherton tribe.
Love it. And what I love what you said, that you brought up how part of the culture not got lost, but kind of put to the wayside.
It went underground.
Yes,
It went
because of,
underground.
yes, the language. And so being true to who I am in this work, a lot of my foundational framework for when I talk about culture is through cultural intelligence and talking about how a lot of people, like we call America the melting pot, but then people were discouraged from being who they are and honoring certain
Yeah.
parts of their culture. And so I love that. And part of what I teach is that there is more than one norm, and that because so many people from so many different cultures make up this country, then we need to honor different cultural norms and values. And I'm so happy to hear that it's going back toward relearning that language so I can identify with that. I love
Thank
it.
you.
Yes.
And to add to that a bit, in our church, we had established a congregational church. The land was deeded to Mohegan by 2 Mohegan women for as long as a Mohegan person walked this earth. And that's the only reason we had a piece of our reservation left. So there were people from Norwich who fundraised to create a church, and it was a congregational church. But Mohegan decided to use it as its social center. So even though it officially was a congregational church, we used it for all of our celebrations, to name our new chiefs, swear in our new tribal councils. And it was so much more than a church to us. It really was our social center. So at the church, we had what we called the Ladies Sewing Society. And so I always say the Ladies Sewing Society was a bit like the Mohegan Underground, because they were the ones that kept our culture vibrant. They were the ones that passed down the herbal medicine and herbal knowledge and cultural practices and spirituality. And to the outside eye, of course, they looked like just a typical sewing group. You know, they had a president and a secretary and a vice president. And, you know, so if anyone from the outside came in to visit the church, it would be kind of like, nothing to see here. We're just making quilts. But it was so much more than that. And there's a phrase attributed to the Ladies Sewing Society, and it's Squawkisa Wotalk, and it means listen to the women. And so their legacy endures with us to this day. So that's exactly correct. There are ways that people can continue to celebrate their culture and celebrate who they are in the face of prejudice and bias.
That's right. And how do you see that as important, especially from the space of academia and healthcare, for us to teach nursing students, I will say health profession students, period, because we work as a team, but how do you see that important in our teachings and integrating those cultural norms into our curriculum?
Well, I think the important thing is to ask the question. As I've said recently to so many people, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. Every tribe throughout the United States is very different, and everyone has different cultural expectations and cultural norms and cultural practices. And I think it's really just so important to ask someone, how do they practice their spirituality? What parts of their culture do they integrate in their own self-care? And how would they want that to be respected? And I think I was really reminded of that because I served on a National Institute of Health advisory board. And we were talking about the All of Us project, which I don't know if you know much about it, but it's about people donating their DNA to this database and all of their medical records to the database, so that researchers can then do, research on that database. Well, they would like 1 million people to participate in that, and they were recruiting American Indians and Alaska Natives to participate in this program without understanding that they needed to really check in with the tribes, because if you're an individual tribal member, of course you can participate in any research that you want. But if there are going to be conclusions made, or there are going to be references made to a tribe, a specific tribe, well, then should that tribe and that tribal community give consent for that research and that participation in research? And that was something that was very foreign to NIH, because they thought, again, this is a great program, and I'm sure it is. But there's more to consent than just the consent of an individual. When you are going to be writing and you are going to be making assumptions about an entire group of people. And we all know that there have been some very difficult studies about Indigenous people in this United States that perhaps were not conducted properly and didn't have the specific consents that they should have had. And so one of the things we talked a lot about was, all right, well, each tribe has different cultural traditions and practices around their biological material. Some people would never be allowed to separate a piece of their DNA from their body. Other tribes, if you have their DNA and you have their samples, would they do a ceremony if you were going to destroy them at NIH, or would they request NIH to send them back when the person died, so that those samples could be buried with that individual? And I think that's just one example of how tribes view things very differently. And each tribe has different culture and traditions around some of those practices.
I love that you said this, because when I teach the cultural intelligence piece, I usually teach from an abstract space, because that is applicable across so many spaces, including in one family, in the same household. They're unique individuals. So what you just described in terms of the tribes, you know one tribe, you know one tribe, because oftentimes people do try to ascribe the same thing across the board. So perfect example of that. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And I think the other piece of that is that I'm still learning. I don't know, I may be an Indigenous person, but I don't know all of the culture and traditions of, say, the Pueblo people, or the Ojibwe people, or Navajo. And so it's just as important to me to understand what their cultural traditions are and how I should approach their people as anyone else would do. Because even if you think about the titles, some tribes call their top executive leader or their top elected leader president. Some call them governors. Some call them chiefs. Some call them tribal chairman or tribal chairwoman. I mean, it's as simple as that sometimes, to really understand and to be sensitive to those issues.
That is awesome. Great examples. So in terms of priority issues, again, what would be a priority to promote health and well-being within your tribe?
Well, and not just within my tribe, but within all the tribes throughout the United States. Tribes don't look at health in a siloed way. So we look at health as a continuum. So it's social health, community health, physical health, spiritual health, environmental health. It's all of those things combined. And so when we think about health, we have to think about how do we incorporate all of those domains into someone's health. And I think that's very important.
So perfect to what you just said, just to go back, because the second half of that question was, do you think this is consistent with other Indigenous nations? So you're already answering that question when we talk about health and well-being. So, yeah.
Right. And one of the things that I think is really important in Indian country altogether is really thinking about traditional ecological knowledge as well as food sovereignty, because all of that contributes to your health. And so much of that was taken away from our native nations. If you're moved from your indigenous homelands to another homeland that is a food desert, that's a problem for you. If you're not eating your traditional foods, that's a problem for you, because your genetic makeup and your genetic history is so intertwined with place. Where you grew up, how you practice your cultural practices, as well as, the traditional foods that you eat, how you incorporate herbs and natural medicines into your diet and into your overall health system is very different. And so I think that tribes are working hard to see how they can reclaim some of those very traditional healthy practices for their people. The other thing I think is really important, and research bears it out, that kids who are engaged with their culture have that culture protecting them from difficult times, right? That gives them a little bit more strength to endure when perhaps they're struggling a bit. And so as we think about how we engage our children in culture and how we connect them to the generations that came before them, we strengthen them. And I find that the United States health system doesn't look at health that way, but tribes definitely do.
Okay, so one question for clarification when we talk about respect and asking the questions, people use different terms to refer to Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to say, even for me, I'm stuck on saying Indigenous or Native. And I don't like when people say Native American because of the history behind all of that. So is that offensive, in your opinion, in terms of when people say Native American or refer to Native peoples or indigenous peoples as Indians?
Well, because American Indian was used so prolifically, I should say, our tribe doesn't really have an issue with using American Indian, but I do think the tendency throughout Indian country is to use indigenous, because I do believe that that is actually a more proper term. But tribes again will vary on how they feel about that. Native American, of course, is so broad. So if you're born here in the United States, you're considered native to this United States. So that's a little bit, I think, less specific. But our official name is the Mohegan Tribe of Indians of Connecticut, and so we're not going to change that. That's how our Constitution is written. That's how we've been referred to in this state. But I do think that using indigenous to describe our first peoples of this United States is definitely more specific, and I think is more descriptive in terms of who we are.
Okay, I wanted to ask that because I'm always correcting people, and I want people to respect indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples and not try to necessarily, I don't want it to get lost, I guess, in some of that terminology and who we're speaking about and speaking to. So I'm always correcting that. I'm like, can we be specific? Because of what you just said,
Right.
Native American can also be you were born here. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that.
Well, and there's a great document, if your students haven't seen it, it's called the United Nations Rights of Indigenous People, Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And so that's how they're referring to all of the indigenous peoples throughout the world. But it's a really terrific document, and it's one that we use when we talk about, what are the rights of indigenous people? How should we be thinking about that? And it does talk a lot about the preservation of culture and how important that is, and the ability to practice your culture, your religion, your healthcare as you traditionally would without infringement on that. And it talks about, free and informed consent for any policies that are being developed around your people. So it's a great document, and it's one that I would, definitely encourage people to look at.
Good, thank you. Because again, we're always looking for resources, because respect is key for me, respect and dignity for all people, and not making all these assumptions, and also trying to force people to fit in the different boxes of norms without acknowledging people's norms. Let's see, I only have 2 more questions. So how can YSN and other health profession schools support and align with the needs of indigenous peoples to move beyond land acknowledgements to operationalize the strategic goals of each tribe, but especially since we're speaking to you on your tribe?
I think the most important thing that any nurse can do is to be a loud advocate for good health. And especially for our Native peoples, Indian Health Services is funded at probably 30% of what everyone else is funded at. The funding continues to be low. It's not even on the mandatory side of the budget like Medicare and Medicaid and Veterans Health. It's on the discretionary side of the budget, despite the fact that our indigenous people have trust and treaty rights to healthcare. Those rights have never been fully executed or fully funded and then fully deployed into Indian country. So when you think about the best way to help Indian people, number one, if you encounter someone in your healthcare system, again, be sensitive to their culture. But if you are looking more broadly, it is to combine your voice and use your voice with all of the indigenous nations and with all of the advocacy organizations to move that budget forward, because it is a long time coming. All of these trust and treaty obligations are centuries old, and yet the United States has not lived up to its promises. And so if you look at the Broken Promises report that was written in, I want to say 2016 now, it details the impacts of what is still happening today to our Indigenous people and to our First Peoples. And our life expectancy through COVID has diminished by 7 years. 7 years, just these last 3 years. That's unconscionable. And it's because we don't have the resources within our tribal communities to properly care for our people. If you don't have running water, you're not able to wash your hands. If you have overcrowded living circumstances, you are not able to segregate your elders and your children. If you don't have healthcare clinics with negative pressure rooms, you cannot isolate your patients. There are so many reasons why tribes were impacted so heavily. If you don't have the internet, how do you know what safe practices are during a pandemic? How do you even communicate that? So I would say that we continue to struggle to this day. And I think that sometimes Indigenous people feel invisible in this United States because of that. And it's time that we gather our resources. And as I always say, when everyone does well, everyone does well. Mm-hmm. It's not reductive, it's additive to the society. And I think that that's what's so important.
Yes, great point. Oh my goodness, great point. Like our thought process is definitely aligned in terms of how can we improve the health literally of all people, and knowing that no one loses when someone else gains when we're advancing equity. I love that. So the last question is there anything else you'd like us to know?
Just that I'm so proud of all of the Yale nursing students. I know that they do wonderful things and they engage with the, kind of global community. They're not insular. They're really looking at how do we improve life and how do we improve health for everyone. And I've seen some of the projects that people do, and I've seen the commitment that the Yale School of Nursing supports and encourages. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And I just, tip my hat to you all and thank you all for caring enough to talk about these very important topics, but they're hard topics to talk about because it means that we're acknowledging that we're not perfect. And perhaps, we haven't always been thoughtful about how we do things, but I don't think it's a matter of blaming. I think it's a matter of always understanding that we can do better and we will do better.
That's right, acknowledging. I always say we learn from the nursing process. I'm an advanced practice nurse, so I know that I have to be able to make a diagnosis. I have to do a history and talk about the things that led to this diagnosis before I can develop a treatment plan. So I see it the same in this work when we're talking about it. Some of the things that are uncomfortable to acknowledge still have to be acknowledged. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that, bringing that point out. So thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you being an example, an exemplar for nursing and all the things that you can accomplish as a nurse, and how different cultures and backgrounds and people from different cultures and backgrounds, we all add to the thread of this tapestry of humanity, So I appreciate it so much. You don't even know. Thank you.
Well, I would say we kotamui. It is my pleasure. And for all of the nursing students, including my nephew, Chris, who is at YSN right now, I would say, many blessings upon you all.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.